Open your Bibles with me, if you would, to Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6, we continue on in our study. This portion of Galatians, we're looking at the very practical application of living a life dominated by the Spirit. And that's the two choices you and I have. A life that is dominated, that's the two choices that a child of God has. A life dominated by the Spirit, or a life that would seem more dominated by the flesh, and one being led by the appetites of the flesh, contrary to the Spirit. And that is the battle that you and I that are saved face. We looked at verse 1, and we're going to look at verse 3 today. And I'm going to take portions of 1, 2, and 3, put them together, because I believe they go together. After having spoken to us about the fruit of the flesh versus the fruit of the Spirit, and the battle that is there, the battle that will always be. You know, I'm learning more and more. You don't get old enough to where you figure out, I'm past that sin or I'm past that temptation. More and more, I see it more and more. I live it. That age doesn't necessarily give one overcoming power over sin or the temptations therein. And so he says in verse 1, "Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, or a transgression, or a sin, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted." This considering thyself will have prominent role in our thoughts tonight. At times, some will need help being overtaken in sin. As folks come alongside of them, they must do so lovingly. They must do so humbly. They must do so with a good, healthy self-consideration. But for the grace of God, this could be me. And then it keeps me humble as I try to help someone else. And without God's love and mercy and grace, let's face it, without God's love, mercy, and grace working in our lives, we'd still be lost. And so that ought to keep one humble, because at very best, all anybody is in this life is still a sinner, but one saved by the grace of God and called upon by God now to reflect Him, to serve Him, and to encourage and help others in that process, all to His glory. In and of myself, I have no power to break the grip of sin. Look with me in Romans chapter 3. I'm talking about verse 1, and I got chasing a rabbit here. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1 about considering ourselves. When you consider yourself, you look at Romans chapter 3 and see this series of psalms that Paul quotes, different psalms through this text in verses 10 through 20, for example. He says, "As it is written, there's none righteous, no, not one." We're considering ourselves tonight as we get to our root, our main verse in Galatians 6:3. "And considering myself, I recognize there's none righteous, no, not one. I'm not, you're not, inherently righteous. I'm not, and you're not, able to aspire to righteousness to a point where in and of ourselves we can be fit to stand before God. None of us can. There's none that understandeth. There's none that seeketh after God." That's considering myself biblically. "They're all gone out of the way. They're all together become unprofitable. There's none that doeth good, no, not one. Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness, whose feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways. The way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith unto them that are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. The right use of the law is to show us our sin. Therefore by the deeds of the law there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. We are at times called to come alongside of someone else, but in the spirit of meekness, humility, with the realization as I consider myself, I'm not in and of myself able to break the grip of sin. I'm not in and of myself able to break the deadness that Paul calls the condition we're in. You hath he quickened who were dead, and he did the quickening. I'm not able to break that. So it should be far from the child of God to look down his nose at anyone else. It should be far from any one of us. The Pharisee said, I'm glad I'm not like that publican. And the Lord said, the publican went home justified as he prayed, Father, have mercy. So as we consider ourselves from verse 1, I recognize that at the end of the day, the very, very best that anybody is a sinner, saved by God's grace. And so he tells us to help one another in verse 1. He tells us to help one another to get out of sin, to those that are overtaken in sin. And the goal is restoration. Verse 2, to bear one another's burdens. And we looked at that last week, and how that is the burden of life that is not the normal burden. That's found in verse 5. The every man bearing his own burdens. We'll get to that later. But this in verse 2 is the bearing of one's burdens, that is the calamity that overtakes someone, that they sit in a pile of rubble and ashes and say, what now? Job's friends had wonderful opportunities to help him bear his burden, and they didn't. They accused him of sin. God let us in on the truth of it, that he was a godly man who hated sin. And so his friends took the wrong approach. His so-called friends took the wrong vantage point. And I think the end of the book of Job shows that they were rebuked of God. And Job was, but not in the same manner. Job just didn't get his questions answered. But he said, bear you one another's burdens. And at times life becomes so difficult, there's opportunities for us to bear one another's burdens. And we do so considering ourselves. Because I'm not above having a burden where I need help with. And this, he says at the end of verse 2, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And we looked at that, and how that love is the center of obedience to the law. That love is the center of his interaction with us. We love him because he first loved us. And so we're continuing to think on this, considering ourselves, as we get to verse 3. The first word starts with for. Well, that seems to me to be connecting it to what's gone on before. For, or because. And so we're called upon by God to, at times, help one another. when they need it, getting out of the snare of sin, to be restored, to bring that restoration to full fruition and grow together in strength and in relationship. And always mindful to see if we can help bear one another's burdens. It's our responsibility. 4, or verse 3, for if a man think himself to be something, when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. It's an interesting verse connected to and put in its context. And in my humble opinion, it has very little to do with one's self-esteem, although it'll be the way it's emphasized so much today, I think incorrectly, with a wrong emphasis on giving the individuals what they want and making sure the individual feels self-fulfilled. He says in this verse, if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. So what is Paul talking about? Well, I think he's continuing to talk about considering himself, considering yourself. And at the very best, any of us are sinners, saved by the grace of God, not able to, in our own strength, overcome sin all by ourselves, not able to impart spiritual life to us, our own selves, all by ourselves. So, what is it that I could boast in of myself? What is it that I could boast in of my own accomplishments that I did all by myself? What could I boast in? I think of Abraham. In Genesis chapter 18, he wanted to intercede for Sodom. And he wanted to do so because Lot was there. And the Lord had told him, I'm going to destroy the city, for the sin of the city is great. And Abraham interceded for the city and said, what about if there's 50? What about if there's 40? What about if there's 30? And he prefaced it by saying, Abraham prefaced it by saying, I'm but dust. I'm nothing. I'm nobody. I'm a created being. At my very, very, very best, I'm a sinner. Saved by your power. Saved by your grace. Yet I'm interceding for this city out of compassion for this city, and I'm coming before you humbly, recognizing I'm but dust in and of myself. Abraham was mightily used of God. Abraham is held up in Romans 4 as a man who, after he saw the power of God, staggered not. Abraham and Sarah are held up in Hebrews 11 as people of faith. But he knew in himself, me? I'm just dust, standing before deity, interceding for a city. But he had a healthy view of himself. In Numbers chapter 12 and in verse 3, you can find this in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, providing I wrote the right verse down in my notes, that Moses was the most humble man. Now I've got myself doubting. Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3. Numbers 12 and verse 3. Now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. Now, he was humble before God. Now, I would argue that Moses finding that place of humility was somewhat of a process. I don't know that he left Pharaoh's tutelage after being 40 years there, an altogether humble man. I rather suspect the 40 years in the backside of the wilderness or desert had a large role to play in Moses' humility. But the man Moses was very humble. He had a right assessment of himself. If he considered himself, he said, I am but dust, I am nothing before God. At my very best, I'm a sinner. Saved by God's power, given new life by God's Spirit, and used by God's grace. And used he was. Look how mightily Abraham was used. Look how mightily Moses was used. I'm not saying these men weren't mightily used of God. They were instruments that God used tremendously. But they had a right assessment of themselves. There's nothing in this, in my own flesh, that I can boast in. There's nothing in my own ability that I can boast in. This is God working in me. Look how mightily Paul was used. And he said, I'm not worthy of the least blessings of God. I persecuted his body, his church. But I am what I am by the grace of God. Let's read that text in 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15. There's one part of this that I want to draw to your attention. Paul said, I'm the least, in verse 9, of all the apostles. We're talking about considering ourselves. We're talking about Paul reminding us in Galatians to have a right esteem. That if we think ourselves something when we're really nothing, we deceive ourselves. Paul said, in verse 9 of 1 Corinthians 15, I'm the least of the apostles, that I'm not meet to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am. And his grace which was bestowed upon me was not in vain. But I labored more abundantly than they all. Yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me. Paul considered himself. And he knew that in and of himself, he's just a sinner. An unworthy sinner. Saved by the grace of God. A recipient of God's blessings. And yet these men that we've mentioned, and so many other illustrations in the scriptures that we could mention, mightily used of God. Powerful in faith. Powerful in their ability to help others. Powerful in their ability to he which is overtaken in a fault, restore. Powerful to be able to do that. Powerful to come alongside and help bear burdens. But they recognized it was of God. They recognized it was God working in them and through them. Look how Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 4. I want you to notice verse 6 and 7. And these things, brethren, I have in a figure transferred to myself and to Apollos, for your sakes. So I'm using myself and Apollos as a picture. Translated a figure, a type. I'm illustrating something with me and Apollos. In chapter 3, he said, I planted, verse 6, I planted, Apollos watered, but God give the increase. Verse 7, so then neither is he that planteth anything, neither is he that watereth, but God, see, that gave the increase. It's all Him. He led one to plant. He led another one to water. He added the blessings of spiritual fruit. We were just instruments in His hands. Neither he that planteth nor that watereth, neither one of us are anything. Mightily used of God. Don't get me wrong. Tremendous strengths and abilities given to them by God. But in and of themselves, sinners, saved by grace, used by grace. God gave the increase. So he says in chapter 4, in verse 6 and 7, I'm using Apollos and myself as a figure or a picture or an illustration. Verse 6, right in the middle, that you may learn in us not to think of men above that which is written, and that that no one of you be puffed up for one against another. For who maketh thee to differ from another? And what hast thou that thou didst not receive? Now if you didst receive it, why dost thou glory as if thou hadst not received it? What ability has God given you? And then remember, He gave it to you. What calling maybe has God placed upon your life? And then remember, that's a calling He placed upon your life. Paul was planting and Apollos was watering, and they were both called of God to do that task. One may be called upon of God to help in this situation, in this arena. One may be called upon by God to encourage in this situation, in this arena. Two completely separate situations. But God says, hey, I want you to come alongside of this person, be a help to him. That's not something we boast in. That's something we're actually should be humbled by and thankful for. Because He calls us to restore those that have been overtaken in a sin. He calls us to bear one another's burdens. Now if a man think himself to be something, when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. How would it ever be fitting for me in my own mind to puff up any gift or ability or strength God has given me? Because God gave it. I am to thank Him. Seeing then these gifts becomes vital as we consider ourselves. Abraham had to consider, how is God using me? How do I stay in God's will, and what direction would God have me to go? There were times when Abraham didn't stay in His will and ran ahead and so on. Moses had to constantly say, how's God using me in this? And he would consider himself in this. And the Bible tells us he was uniquely humble before God. So identifying our strengths is a very important aspect of this. Not so that we can boast in them, but so that we may know better how that the Lord has equipped us for His service to bring glory to Him. That we know, okay, this is a strength I have, but that God has given me, not that I have inherently. This is a strength where God has given me. This is a ministry that God has given me. This is a calling God has put upon my life. This is a burden God has put in my heart to just be a prayer warrior for this situation and come alongside this person and be regular in trying to encourage them and so on. And do so thanking God for the opportunity and the privilege. Not thinking more highly of myself than I ought. If I see these gifts and strengths as being of myself, I quickly could get prideful. One could quickly get prideful. If one sees them as being born of one's own strength and ability and ingenuity and wisdom and so on, this is all of me, according to this text, he's deceived. If a man think himself to be something when he is nothing in and of himself, he deceiveth himself. If I think myself to be above sin, why, I would never have trouble with that sin or any other sin. I deceive myself. See, he tells us to consider ourselves. If I think I'm too good to help someone else, I have a wrong estimation of myself. I have a wrong estimation of God's calling in my life. And I am truly deceived. And again, I am not talking about self-esteem or the lack thereof. That's really not my point. To right estimation and understanding of how God has called me into His service and how He's equipped. He doesn't call the qualified. He didn't call Moses into His service because he was qualified. He qualifies the called. He made Moses ready for the calling He put upon his life. So God gets all the glory. And Moses, as we read in Numbers, was a humble man. So we rightly assess, with humility, grace, and thanksgiving, God has given me a strength in this area. God has given me a ministry of encouragement. God has given me a ministry of prayer. God has given me this, that, and the other thing. And I want to use it for His glory. And then you can continue to do that humbly. And you can continue to do that seeking His honor, His glory. Look at Philippians chapter 2. Very familiar. Verse 3. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Sorry. The Lord has a way of humbling. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things. That's what we tend to do. We tend to esteem self better than others, and we tend to look at one's own things more than the things of others. And it takes a lot of grace and strength to not focus on self. But as we look at this practical section of Galatians, it's very much, we consider ourselves, but it's very much in the process of striving to help others, knowing how that we can, and so on. And this passage in Philippians, Paul tells us, esteem others better than yourself. Paul says in Romans, preferring one another. Paul says in Hebrews, considering one another, to provoke unto love and to good works. So we look to the Lord for grace and wisdom to help and encourage one another, and doing so with a right assessment, not the Pharisaical assessment. I'm glad I'm not like that person. I'd never be in that ditch. Not that kind of assessment. But thankful to the Lord, maybe, for being put in a position to help someone, knowing, but for the grace of God, that could be me. Put in the position to help someone, knowing I'm not above it. Because if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. But on the other hand, if a man is blessed of God, knows that he's saved by the grace of God and maybe given a strength or two to be used of God for His glory, let him or her be used mightily for the glory of God. And it won't tend to make them prideful if they keep it all in biblical perspective. Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, neither one of us are anything. God gave the increase. May God use us mightily in our sphere of influence to help, to encourage, to strengthen, and all for the underlying goal of bringing glory to Him. Let's stand.